My name is Tanya Domi. I'm a professor of international public affairs at SEBA, and I have a faculty affiliate appointment at Harriman, where I've been teaching the last 15 years. And I'm really thrilled to have this discussion today with colleagues at the Newlines Institute in Washington and the Raoul Human Rights Center in Montreal, who actually co-published a report on Ukraine. Copies of it are available here on our table. That was the first report on Ukraine with regard to crimes violating the Genocide Convention. It received quite a bit of attention, and rightfully so, given the atrocities that were happening then and continue to this moment. So it's really a pleasure to have the co-producing institutions here to talk about it. And the title of this report was An Independent Legal Analysis of the Russian Federation's Breaches of the Genocide Convention in Ukraine and the Duty to Prevent. And secondly, we're going to talk about that report, and also that Newlines Institute with many colleagues has launched a campaign for reparations for Ukraine. And there's also an outline and that model of that campaign available here and online. And so without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our guests. I'm really delighted to introduce Dr. Azeem Ibrahim, who is a research professor at the Strategic Studies Institute, U.S. Army War College, and a director of the Newlines Institute for Strategy and Policy in Washington. He received his PhD from Cambridge, after which he completed fellowships at Oxford, Harvard, and Yale. Dr. Ibrahim is author of the seminal books, The Rohingyas, Inside Myanmar's Genocide, Radical Origins, Why We Are Losing the War Against Islamic Extremism, and The Authoritarian Century, Omens of a Post-Liberal Future. Thank you so much for coming today, Azeem. It's really wonderful to finally meet you in person. I'd also like to introduce Yonah Diamond, who is joining us today from Montreal. Great to have you here as well. Yonah is an international human rights lawyer at the Raoul Wallenberg Center and the principal author of the Wallenberg Newlines expert report, The Independent Legal Analysis on the Russian Federation Breaches of the Genocide Convention. And I am also delighted to introduce my colleague, Christopher Atwood, who is a student here at Harriman, and an advocacy fellow for Razom for Ukraine, and a graduate student at Columbia University, specializing in perceptions of identity and colonial violence in Eastern Europe. Prior to joining Razom, he served as a contributor and advisor on this independent report at the Newlines Institute. He's also has served as an advisor on media and communications at the Sophilist Foundation, NGO in Kiev. So without any further ado, I want to turn the opening comments over to Dr. Ibrahim. What we'll do is we have an online audience. I'm going to be getting questions from them, and I will, after we make opening remarks and I ask some questions, then we'll turn to questions in the room and questions online. Dr.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Domi, and thank you so much to the Harriman Institute for hosting this very important event at this very critical time. Ladies and gentlemen, the word genocide is often used very loosely and very interchangeably with mass murder and mass atrocities. But the word genocide has actually got a very precise legal definition. And that definition is presented to us in the 1948 Genocide Convention. And at the heart of this definition, what anchors this definition is intent. The intent to destroy a group in whole or in part, to destroy a protected group in whole or in part. And this intent can be attributed to a state through evidence of a general plan, to documents, statements, to policy, or it could be inferred from the systematic pattern of atrocities. There are 5 genocidal acts: killing, causing serious harm, deliberately inflicting physical destruction of the conditions of life, birth prevention, and forcibly transferring children. Now notice out of the 5 key acts, only 1 is killing. Now let me just give you a very quick background of how we came to do this report. Earlier or last year, myself and my esteemed colleague here at the Royal Wallenberg Centre, we undertook this report on the Uyghur genocide. This report was instrumental in navigating the US State Department to make its genocide determination. And based on this report, I was invited by the Ministry of Health in Ukraine to make a trip to Ukraine in March this year to see if we can undertake a similar report of genocidal acts in Ukraine. So in March, April of this year, I travelled to Ukraine. I met a number of witnesses. I took testimonials. I looked at evidence. And on my return, myself and the Raoul Wallenberg Centre compiled a team of experts, open source intelligence experts, language experts, linguistical experts, to try to ascertain and look at evidence and see how far the genocidal acts have gone. And the conclusion we came to after applying all the evidence to the 1948 Genocide Convention is, number 1, that the Russian Federation has breached the Genocide Convention. 2, the Russian Federation bears state responsibility for inciting genocide. And 3, that the pattern of atrocities indicate an intent to destroy a national group, which is in breach of Article 3C of the Genocide Convention. Now, it's important to note that the act of inciting genocide is that genocide, the genocidal act itself is a crime in itself, which can be prosecuted. But we can see from the rhetoric that was emerging from Russia that this was something in preparation for a considerable amount of time. For example, in July 2021, Putin wrote in an essay that Ukraine is an artificial creation. So they deny that Ukraine has its own language and culture and its own history. The chair of the Duma, for example, on February 26th said that Vladislav Sukov said that there is no Ukraine, there is no Ukrainianness. This is a disorder of the mind. There is no nation. So they essentially denied that Ukrainianness, Ukrainian identity actually exists. This has also been translated into action. So it's not just the rhetoric, it's also the action. For example, we have evidence of, and this is, remember, back in March, April, of over 180,000 Ukrainian children that are forcibly transferred, forcibly moved from Ukraine into Russia. And they'll spread out throughout all of Russia to stop them coalescing as a single identity group. We also see some messages going between soldiers on the Telegram channels saying things like, rape the Nazi whores, so they don't want to have children anymore. Now, why is this important? Why is the title of the report on Russian breaches of the Genocide Convention? This is important because the Genocide Convention, the purpose of the Genocide Convention is to prevent and punish genocide. Prevent. The duty to prevent comes first. Now, we have a situation in which policymakers are putting a lot of emphasis on the punishment, talking about setting up tribunals and having hearings and collecting evidence, and all of that is very important, and all of that should and must continue. But the primary purpose of the convention is the duty to prevent, is that when the minimum threshold of serious risk of genocide has been reached, the obligation is on all 151 signatories to the Genocide Convention to intervene to stop it happening, to stop it spilling over into a full-scale genocide. So our report, and my esteemed colleague here, Yonah, will speak more on this, clearly indicates that the evidence, and this is back in April, clearly indicated that there is the war, the objective of Putin's war in Ukraine is genocidal in its nature, is to wipe out Ukrainianness, to wipe out Ukrainian identity. Now, coming fast forward to the current day, we are now hopefully beginning to see the beginning of the end of the war. Ukraine is doing significantly better than anybody had anticipated. Almost everybody, every intelligence agency believes that this is going to be over in 2 weeks. Putin will install his puppet government and then things will just go back to normal and the West will accept it. But that has simply not happened. And Ukrainians are doing significantly better than any strategist had anticipated. Now the question arises, who is going to pay for the damage done to Ukraine? Our estimates indicate that at the very minimum, the damage is approximately $300 billion. Now, this is expected to rise to at least $500 billion, if not $1 trillion, when all is said and done. So who's going to pay for this? How are we going to get reparations for Ukraine? So the reason we had to produce this report, the multilateral action model on reparations, is simply because we came to the conclusion that the current international system is simply not able and not fit to provide reparations. And I'll give you a very quick reason for this. Iraq paid Kuwait $52 billion in reparations. And in fact, they made the final payment just in February of this year. So $52 billion to Kuwait for illegally invading Kuwait. But this was only after Iraq was defeated by an international coalition of nations. Iraq was subsequently occupied by that coalition of nations, and the Security Council mandated it. And none of those three things will happen in the case of Russia. Russia is not going to be defeated by an international coalition in terms of Russia itself. It will not be occupied by any nation, and the Security Council will clearly not mandate any reparation, and Russia will never accept it as done any wrong. So what our model does is it tries to navigate around that. How do you get out of that? So we have developed this model with legal scholars. One of them actually worked on the Iraq-Kuwait reparations. And what this multilateral action model reparations does is to use Russian state assets that have been frozen and use them and repurpose them for the rebuilding of Ukraine. So Russian state assets that are linked to Putin, that are linked to his oligarchs, that people that have essentially ill-gotten gains, wealth, to repurpose those. And we are actually doing another report at the moment, which we're just in the process of commissioning, is to do an audit of what those Russian assets actually are. But just in a small country like Belgium, for example, we know it's about $30 billion. It's a significant amount. And one of the reasons why I believe this report will get picked up, and so far we've seen it get picked up at the UN General Assembly had a vote on this, the European Parliament had a vote on this as well, but this will get accelerated, because in this current economic environment, it is simply not viable for any policymaker, whether in Europe, the US, or elsewhere, to stand up and say, our taxpayers should be on the bill for this, should essentially be on the line to pay for this. In the current economic environment, we have a cost of living crisis, we have inflation and everything else. It is simply not viable for any policy maker to say we're going to have an international vote of confidence and we are going to pledge $80 billion or whatever it might be. So, and this will send the strongest message to Putin and his cronies that, look, there is a price to pay for this. And final point, that this also has much larger implications. The current international system is simply not working. This is a fact. The system, Security Council, is not working. We have 2 members of the Security Council, 2 members, both of them nuclear powers. One of them has invaded its democratic neighbour, and the other one is threatening to invade its democratic neighbour. The system is not just dysfunctional, it has become irrelevant. And this will send the strongest message, particularly to members of the CCP and the Politburo in Beijing, that any adventures in China and Taiwan will result in their assets being frozen and repurposed for compensation. And there's absolutely, make no mistake, all members of the Politburo have their investments in the West. None of them have their money, over a certain amount in Beijing or elsewhere, unless they fall out with the government, and that money is simply disappears. And if you don't believe me, ask Jack Ma, ask Bo Xilai, ask Desmond Chong. As soon as you fall foul of Xi Jinping, your money's taken away. All of them have investments here in the West. All of the children have dual passports because they know their system is rotten. And this will send the strongest message that any adventures in Taiwan will mean that your assets have risk of seizure. So with that, I will pass it on back to the chair, Professor Domi.
Sure. Yonah, to you.
Yeah. As Azeem mentioned, genocide is loosely used, but it also takes a very long time for countries in the international community to get their act together in terms of when we can even discuss genocide, when courts can hear genocide cases. And the main two courts really in the international community, International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, as well as national jurisdictions that have incorporated the core international crimes in their jurisdictions, who can bring perpetrators to justice. But that's one element of how the world can confront and address genocide and seek justice for the victims, although it comes after the fact. And we know the shortcomings of that system as well in terms of the actual results, let's say, from the International Criminal Court, where there's only been convictions in 5 cases, Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, and Mali. And some have even been released already, have served their sentences. And this is in the 20 years of the International Criminal Court's existence. And so my colleague Azeem from the Newlines Institute and at the Wallenberg Center, we've developed somewhat of an innovation in terms of gathering legal experts from around the world, from every UN regional group, as we did in our first report on the atrocities against the Uyghurs, and now again in Russia's atrocities in Ukraine, including regional experts and experts on sexual violence, and so a multidisciplinary group of experts to come together to assess, which is a little bit like what the UN does when they appoint experts to assess the situation, as in Myanmar or ISIS crimes. But to apply the Genocide Convention as it was intended to, as Azeem mentioned, with its object and purpose of prevention. The Genocide Convention was established to safeguard the existence of groups, of course, before they faced genocide. And so that was really part of the impetus for both of these reports. And I'm proud to see that we've kind of moved the dial on these discussions in the amongst officials and lawyers internationally as to when a country breaches the Genocide Convention, which is a different question from when an individual perpetrator can be held accountable. And there are different standards, and countries need to confront the risk of genocide with the same force that they address individual perpetrators, and in the much higher standards that are required to convict someone of genocide down the road. And since we've released our report, we've actually been quite shocked to see how our original analysis continues to apply, and how the incitement campaign has even gotten worse in certain ways. And one need look no further than statements from the heads of Russia's security and defense industries, like Dmitry Medvedev, former deputy prime minister of Russia, statements as to we will do everything to make them disappear or do away with them as our grandfathers failed to do. We can exterminate you, heads of the regional self-declared governor of Donetsk, and so on, and the statements and the dehumanization campaign of likening Ukrainians to worms or even cockroaches and pathogens or contamination, all the very clear precursors of previous genocides that are very openly stated by the highest levels of Russia's establishment, as well as state-run media commentators and hosts. And so we were actually shocked with how open the incitement to genocide campaign is. And now, of course, the assessment of Russia's infliction of conditions of life, which are calculated to destroy the group physically, which are escalating now in some ways by targeting critical infrastructure on a massive scale. I know many have seen the images of Ukraine in the dark versus surrounding countries. And so, and the destruction of health facilities continues. So everything that we kind of were analyzing originally remains tactics of the Russian army, including rape and sexual violence as a military strategy. And so that's what I'll say for now. And so the real objective is to put states on notice that Russia is in breach of the Genocide Convention, imposing a duty to impose any measures that will protect the group at risk and hold and deter Russia from continuing to breach the Genocide Convention. Because as long as they're in Ukraine, there's a serious risk of genocide that continues.
Thank you very much, Christopher.
Sure. I just want to say a couple of things. In addition to what Azeem and Yonah have very clearly laid out, I kind of want to stress and emphasize that, right, this conversation we're having today is, it's yesterday was 6 months after we released the report. On Saturday was Holodomor Memorial Day. This is 90 years since Russia's genocide of Ukrainians in the Soviet era. This rhetoric that we're seeing and this violence that we're seeing is part of a cycle. When you speak to Ukrainians, I spoke to a Ukrainian journalist just this past Friday who said that she has reassessed what the Holodomor means to her because she sees the violence that is happening right now. The way she put it is nobody can deny that the Holodomor was a genocide when you see what Russia is doing now, what Russia did following that genocide and what it's continued to do now. After the publication of the report, I joined Raoul for Ukraine on advocacy initiatives. And one of the biggest advocacy initiatives that we have undertaken, in large part thanks to Azeem's work and thanks to Yonah's work, both representing the Newlines Institute and the Raoul Wallenberg Center, we have been pushing very much for recognition of Russia's invasion as a genocide. And just for my contribution to an opening statement, I would just like to briefly read a short letter that we wrote to the Congressional Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committees in an effort to get them to pass legislation recognizing Russia's atrocities in Ukraine as genocide. So on November 26th, Ukrainians around the world commemorated Holodomor Memorial Day, remembering the millions of Ukrainians starved to death by the Soviet regime in an artificially created famine. Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish lawyer who first coined the term genocide, called the Holodomor a classic example of Soviet genocide. His work formed the basis of the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, which the United States helped draft and is party to. Indeed, in 2018, the United States House of Representatives recognized the Holodomor as genocide. Today, the Ukrainian nation is once again fighting for its right to exist. We are thankful for U.S. support for Ukraine, and we are grateful for U.S. leadership in that process. In the same spirit, we are urging these members of Congress to pass these resolutions which recognize Russia's actions in Ukraine as genocide. Russian officials have conducted an incitement campaign and adhered to a policy of attempting not just to conquer Ukraine, but to eliminate Ukrainians as a separate national group. This is all too apparent through the coordinated campaign of eliminationist rhetoric disseminated by state-run media, military campaigns intentionally targeting civilian areas and life-sustaining infrastructure, and military occupation regimes that seek to arrest, deport, and destroy members of the Ukrainian nationality. Russia's rhetoric categorically paints Ukrainians who view themselves as a distinct national group as Nazis. This rhetoric frames the existence of Ukrainians as a threat to Russia, directly implying that destroying Ukrainians is needed to win a civilizational struggle. Putin has let other officials and state propagandists clarify what the military goal of denazification means. Russia's Security Council Deputy Chairman Dmitry Medvedev, who was the previous president, has stated openly, "I hate them, they are bastards and degenerates, I will do everything to make them disappear." One infamous op-ed or opinion piece published in the tightly Kremlin-controlled outlet RIA Novosti said that a significant part of the masses will need to be subjected to re-education, ideological suppression, and forced labor, or at least those who will not be subject to the death penalty or prison. In addition to indiscriminately shelling Ukrainian civilians during the course of military operations, the Russian military has carried out executions of Ukrainian civilians, tortured them, forcibly deported them, and deliberately targeted them in missile and artillery attacks. The devastating images we've seen in Bucha, Irpin, Mariupol, Izium, these are not isolated incidents. They are emblematic of a systematic, widespread campaign perpetrated by Russian occupiers. Some of the perpetrators have been publicly awarded by the Kremlin for their crimes. Disturbing and systematic pattern of sexual violence has emerged with, as Azeem pointed to, intercepted audio revealing that Russian soldiers brag and encourage each other to carry out rapes against Ukrainian women. By Russia's own count, millions of Ukrainians have been deported. Russia has forcefully deported thousands of Ukrainian children, which is directly in violation of the Genocide Convention. Russian government officials have spoken on the need to indoctrinate Ukrainian children. Russia's children's rights ombudswoman, Maria Lvova-Belova, bragged that after a group of Ukrainian children were forcibly deported to the Moscow region, their love for Ukraine had been transformed into a love for Russia. This same group of children, she derided for singing the Ukrainian national anthem on the way to Moscow, and they destroyed their self-identity within a matter of weeks or months. Indeed, Ukrainian school children who remain in occupied areas are forced or pressured to reject their own national identity, studying under an imposed school curriculum that denies Ukraine's distinct history and nationhood. These policies in Ukraine undoubtedly point to genocidal intent and genocidal acts. And so we call on Congress to reaffirm America's commitment to our fundamental principles, underscoring the seriousness of Russia's crimes. If we do not recognize this invasion for what it is, we not only fail the Ukrainian people, but we neglect our own security interests and our foundational values as a country. And with that, I will turn it back to Professor Domi.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm going to make comments on the sexual violence section of the report, and this is part of how I came to contribute as a regional expert. Our colleague at Newlines, Emily Prey, is in London today at a major conference on conflict-related sexual violence that's being hosted by the UK government. It's really important that she's there. She also shared some comments with me, but I will say one thing before I share her comments. During the past 30 years, in which numerous ethnic wars have taken place, rape as a tool of war has occurred, and it has only escalated. We can only look to Iraq on these Yazidis. We can look to Bosnia and Herzegovina, Rwanda, Kosovo, and now Ukraine. Ukraine is not an exception. Indeed, the UN Special Rapporteur on conflict-related sexual violence recently reported another level of intent of issuing Viagra to Russian soldiers. This is another layer and escalation. Rape is a war crime. It has been a war crime since the 1907 convention of the Hague Convention of 1907. And indeed, but it was never enforced. It was never upheld at Nuremberg, although in council, the lower courts actually drafted a clause to prosecute rape, but they never actually activated that clause. And it wasn't prosecuted at Tokyo. And the remarkable aspect of this phenomenon, it has only been in the last 30 years that international jurisprudence has been generated as a consequence of Rwanda and Bosnia and Herzegovina that created the jurisprudence that actually lays down another legal mechanism that proves for once and for all that it is a war crime, is a criminal act, and it can yield to genocide, a pattern and a practice. So I'm going to share Emily's comments. Genocide is not a crime of scale. It is not a crime of killing. It is a crime of intent, as our previous speakers have said. And without full understanding of how gender interacts with genocide, the international community and the signatories to the Genocide Convention are ill-equipped to effectively do their duty under international law to prevent and punish this crime. Under Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, there are 5 genocidal acts, which we've already been discussed. Despite this, the world continues to put these crimes in a hierarchy and privilege the act of killing over other non-lethal genocidal acts. These non-lethal acts can include, but are not limited to, forcible separation of children from their families, to break familial bonds, rape and sexual violence, and inflicting conditions of life intended to bring about the destruction of the group in whole or in part, like military sieges, destroying infrastructure and vital health care facilities, and deliberate attacks on shelters and humanitarian corridors, all of which have been seen in Ukraine and have been detailed in our report. Typically, when genocides occur, men are more likely to be victims of mass killing, while women are more likely to be victims of non-lethal genocidal acts like rape or sexual torture. We are seeing this in Ukraine, while men are also victims of non-lethal acts. And let me add to this, the first case tried at the International War Crimes Tribunal of former Yugoslavia was a case involving Duško Tadić, who actually ordered and directed the sexual torture of men against men. Very grotesque. I won't get into the details, but that was the first case that actually demonstrated that men were raped. And it is only maybe 30 years later that men are coming forward as victims now of these incredibly traumatic acts. And I would add that not only these are acts of sexual torture that we're seeing, but also enforced sterilization. There are stories like women's stories that are usually overlooked or ignored, and they are not recognized by prosecutors after the fact. The vast majority of survivors of genocide will never receive justice simply because they are viewed less as victims and more as survivors. And that is one of the major issues among the surviving community, is that they are not able to access justice. And this war and the extreme acts of violence has been described. A number of reporters have indicated in Ukraine, which is to their credit, they actually were able to tap into conversations between husband and wives that are Russian, with the wife agreeing that the husband should rape Ukrainian women. It's really not only, it's brazen, but it's another escalation from past wars in the recent past. So perpetrators of genocide have an understanding of gender, whether they're cognizant of it or not, because they target their victims based on gender and their roles in society. Women are targeted for their roles as mothers, wives, bearers of children, and continue on the family line, I would also add that it is no coincidence that when armies go in to rape and pillage, that this actually breaks up families and actually causes depopulation. So there is an outcome that they're seeking to depopulate so that they can take over that territory. And raping women is one of the most effective ways to do that. So women, specifically because of their sexual and reproductive organs, are always targeted in genocide, and the war in Ukraine is no exception. Emily encourages anyone to read the Global Justice Center's report, Beyond Killing, and the Newlines report on gender and genocide in the 21st century. I would also add that we have seen how the Russian forces are using rape as a tool and a method of war. This continues a pattern and practice that we've seen in all the countries I aforementioned. What's so terrible about this is that there's a paucity of justice. There are very few courts availed to people to seek justice and have their crimes recognized. And this also, I would add, Azeem, is a failure of the international order. So I'll conclude my remarks with that. And I want to ask a question about the campaign. You've launched this campaign, and where have you gone with the campaign, and what's been the reaction?
So in terms of the reparations model, we have launched it at the European Union in Brussels. We had a very good pickup from members of the European Parliament. So subsequent to our launch, a number of member countries got in touch with us asking for more details on this so that they can table it in their respective parliaments. I think one of the primary motivations is not just the fact that Ukraine deserves reparations and the fact that Russia has to be punished and other countries have to be deterred, but simply because, and they were completely frank with us, that look, we don't believe our taxpayers should be paying for this huge cost that the Russians have inflicted upon Ukraine. So a number of countries have gone in touch with us. Subsequent to that, we also had a roundtable at the British Parliament. We have a number of cabinet ministers, a number of members of Parliament attend, and there was a lot of interest in this. And because of the election in the United States, there has been a little bit of a delay, but we have been presenting the idea of the model to various members of Congress and the Senate. So there is a considerable amount of interest in this. And as you can see, if you follow the news, a lot of this is getting a lot more kind of pickup. This is now being discussed in various policy circles, as I mentioned, the General Assembly at the UN and other in the European Union. And as such, I believe it's almost inevitable that there can have to be some sort of mechanism by which you have to make Russia pay. There is no other international vehicle that's available to force Russia to pay compensation, reparations. Russia will never accept it, hasn't done anything wrong at all. So that avenue itself is kind of closed down, so it has to be forced upon them. Yeah, so I think it's in the very kind of early stages. Our objective is to disseminate this idea and this model as much as we can. Then it's obviously up to the policymakers then to kind of make a decision. But so far, there's been quite a lot of interesting pickup on this.
So the United States initiated the sanctions against the Russians, and so through the Treasury Department, they've been able to confiscate, yachts and other various properties of the oligarchs. And I'm sure that the United States could certainly yield some of their craft in how they apply sanctions and seize properties. To help on this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Nations have seized significant amounts of Russian assets. And if you look at our report, we actually have a one-page model that actually shows all the different classes of Russian assets. So it's not just Russian state assets. There's also improbably rich civil servants. So you have, for example, somebody who works in the driving license agency who's got a $20 million apartment in Belgravia, London. Just doesn't really add up. And so all of these assets that are targeted and ripe for seizure and by states are all essentially criminal assets. And the mechanism by which states can kind of bypass and a lot of the legal obstacles is a mechanism that the UK uses, what they call unexplained wealth orders. So you either explain how you, as a professor at Columbia, managed to buy this $200 million yacht, or otherwise the state will seize this. So unless you can actually prove where the wealth came from, then it's right for seizure. So almost all Russian assets are connected to the Putin's regime. It's simply not possible to become a billionaire in Russia unless you're part of the actual regime apparatus.
Right.
And as we know, Putin is regarded, in fact, by many estimates as the richest person in the world, but he has literally nothing on his name. So where are his assets? They're basically under all sorts of legal kind of obfuscation and vehicles. And our report goes through this, different categories in international law that you can actually use. And we're actually, as I indicated, I'm in the process of commissioning another report by a leading expert on the Russian post-Soviet economy to actually undertake an audit of where those assets actually are, which countries have the most, and essentially use that as a kind of a blueprint for countries to look at. So myself and Yonah, for example, were in Ottawa just a couple of weeks ago. We presented a lot of this material to the various parliamentary committees, and we were very surprised to learn that Ottawa had in Canada, despite the immense Russian wealth that's actually there, they had frozen. How much was it?
130 million.
112 million. Yeah, which is $112 million, which is essentially, as one member of parliament pointed out, is the cost of a bathroom on a yacht. So, and the key reluctance is that, well, look, these people are obviously extremely wealthy. As soon as you seize their assets, they're going to lawyer up and come after the state for illegally seizing their assets. But there's vehicles and mechanisms to get around that, unexplained wealth orders and corruption orders, all sorts of stuff. So I firmly believe this is inevitable.
Okay. So Yonah, as you indicated with this report, that it seems like genocide from day one has been occurring in Ukraine. In terms of scale, we haven't really seen anything like this. It's a huge country with a significant population being depopulated, forced deportations. I mean, every day is crime. Where do you think this registers in international justice? Like, where do we go with this?
Yeah.
Because the ICC can't try a crime of aggression.
Right. Yeah, there are so many. There are different processes underway. Ukraine has domestic investigations of nearing 50,000 war crime investigations now. The ICC dispatched its largest team, apparently, the Ukraine, to investigate. There are, I think, like 18 different countries that are putting together a joint mechanism to investigate. There are initiatives to establish a special tribunal for the crime of aggression, which is another mechanism that states should adopt and endorse, if not to even eventually establish such a tribunal, at the very least to indicate to the architects of this war that they're in the docket of the accused and will face isolation. Anyone who allies themselves with Putin will face justice. So there are all these different, and then of course there's the International Court of Justice, which Ukraine has brought Russia to the ICJ, but based on the theory that you can't abuse the Genocide Convention to invade a country, or and to make blatantly false claims that Ukraine is committing genocide in order to justify your invasion as a pretext. So they have all these different, but they're very long processes, and none of those will actually work towards protecting civilians and Ukrainians in real time and preventing, in the sense of signaling that they'll face justice. It will, because it might deter criminals from continuing to wage this war. But the fact of the matter is that those waging the war are sitting comfortably in Moscow, over 1,000 kilometers in the front lines. And so the question for the international community is, how do we impose real costs on those perpetrators? Because as long as they're even continuing to profit potentially from the war machine, we won't see justice, right? And so the reparations and other initiatives like that are so key, in my opinion, to really go after those who are really responsible for the war and all of its attendant atrocities. The Russian soldiers are largely taken from far reaches of Russia, from ethnic minorities, and so used as cannon fodder. And so the real architects need to be held accountable. So yeah, it's that's why and the Genocide Convention analysis is important to underpin further action to hold these perpetrators accountable. And that's why I think Razom's campaign to get this resolution passed in the House and the Senate, it's really it seems it's an obligation on state officials to recognize when a foundational treaty of international law is being so openly breached, the Genocide Convention, and this resolution there's nothing controversial about it at all. It doesn't even try to it's only about preventing future acts of genocide by Russia and identifying the crimes for what they are. So, but that can also serve as a basis for reparations, because when a country is breaching the Genocide Convention, Ukraine is entitled to reparations, separate from a criminal matter, sort of like a civil matter when Russia is breaching a treaty.
It's compensation.
Yeah.
Right. I just have another comment, and I want to ask you, Azeem, and then I'll come to you, Christopher. There is precedent for suspending member states' membership in the General Assembly, in the Security Council, potentially in the case of South Africa on apartheid, they were suspended. And is this not a moment for the UN to suspend the Russian Federation from the Security Council to initiate it in the General Assembly?
Yeah.
I mean, I just think this is such a crisis. It's sidelined the United Nations.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I think there is precedence for this. I think as I indicated earlier, the international system as it was designed and set up is simply not functioning as it was. The Security Council is simply not, just essentially irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
The entire apparatus of UN, particularly many of the agencies, are essentially now, particularly with the Chinese Communist Party, many of them have literally just been taken over. China controlled 4 out of 11 of the major UN agencies. No other countries ever controlled more than one. And this is an explicit and overt campaign of the CCP to take over a lot of these agencies. Now, we have a situation, for example, in the UN Human Rights Council, the most important human rights body in the world. And who do we have as members of that? We have Russia, China, Venezuela, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Cuba. It's astonishing. These are all the bastions of protecting global. Yeah, these are supposed to be protecting global human rights. So the system is simply not functioning, and I don't believe that if you're going to be reliant on the UN to deliver anything,
Right.
I think you'll be hugely disappointed. Hence why we need to start looking at alternative models and vehicles by which to do this. And in democracies, I was a very firm believer in this idea of alliance of democracies working together, because we have international agencies that have essentially just been completely taken over by these autocracies. I would just like to point out very quickly, further to what Yonah had actually said, there is a lot of emphasis on tribunals and criminal prosecutions and so on, and all of that is very important. But there seems to be a complete reluctance of states to meet their obligations under Article 1 of the Genocide Convention, which is all about prevent. It's all about prevent. And states will make all sorts of claims that, well, we need to wait for a court decision to actually do this. And this is completely incorrect in international law. Every state is sovereign. Every state has to come to its own decision. There is no mechanism by which you wait for a court. All treaties are between states. If you waited for courts, then essentially the genocide will be over. It makes it completely redundant that you have a duty to prevent until a court makes a determination. And so countries are funding the ICC action, they're supporting the ICC action, very important. But it's also a mechanism by which to obfuscate and kind of kick the can down the road, because they don't want to meet their obligations. Because once a genocide or a serious risk of genocide determination has been made, then it means those countries need to do everything in their power to stop genocide happening. And that's mean economically, politically, culturally, financially. It means complete. That means no more buying Russian oil. As many countries continue to do so, no more repairing turbines from Russia, no more in any normal kind of transactions. And obviously countries don't want to do that, so they want to have the room for the maneuver. And so very quickly, final point, if you remember in Samantha Power's book, she indicated during the Rwanda genocide, there was a memo that was leaked, and it was very telling. It was a memo, I think it went from the White House to the Pentagon or the other way around, and it said, be careful. Legal at state trying to classify this as a genocide will obligate us to do something. So that indicates very clearly why they confuse, muddy the water, and kick the can down the road. Because once that determination has been made, even in a case like Rwanda, it will obligate us to do something. I mean, there's no appetite to do anything.
And Albright killed that. Yes, I just want to add that Biden opened the door here in April when he made his off-the-cuff remarks that it was a genocide. I think the government, kind of backpedaled on this. It's a complete failure of the international order. Christopher, tell us why raison is so important, and if you have any other thoughts that you'd like to share.
Well, I mean, in terms of raison, right? Like the appealing aspect of raison is the humanitarian aspect of raison, which is what gives us our legitimacy and knowledge in the first place. Raising more than $60 million and having the vast majority of that reach Ukraine already in order to provide humanitarian aid to Ukrainian defenders, to hospitals, to civilians, working with organizations in Ukraine. In terms of advocacy, what is incredibly important for us is being a resource and helping inform decision makers and various stakeholders in what we're doing in terms of the US, what the US is doing. And so from our perspective, kind of as Yonah pointed out, calling something what it is incredibly important. Also to Azeem's point, right? Like in maintaining this international order, in understanding what our role actually needs to be, and understanding what is actually happening. A couple weeks ago, or a week ago, there was a briefing at the Helsinki Commission, where Professor Timothy Snyder from Yale gave some remarks, and one of the things he pointed out was typically when we see governments carrying out these kinds of atrocities and carrying out a genocide, what you see is governments trying to hide the fact of what they are doing. This is the opposite case, and it's shocking a lot of people. It is not normal for a government to openly brag about deporting children and transferring them to another national group and indoctrinating them to reject their own national identity. That is bonkers. That is not something that governments typically do. Governments hide that. Governments don't typically want to incriminate themselves to the level that Russia is incriminating itself. And just one of the most fascinating quotes that we ended up putting into the report to illustrate Russia's genocidal intent comes from one of Russia's chief propagandists, Margarita Simonyan, who when describing like Ukrainian Nazis or Ukrainians as Nazis, she said, quote, "A significant part of Ukraine or the Ukrainian people turned out to be in the grip of a Nazi frenzy." And that Nazi frenzy is identifying as Ukrainian and not as Russian.
Right.
So she herself says a significant part of the national group needs to be dealt with in some way. And soldiers interpret that very clearly. We've seen in every time there is liberation, we understand how soldiers interpret this directive of denazification. It is seek out Ukrainians who identify themselves as Ukrainians and who reject Russian occupation and destroy them. It means destroying cultural leaders. In occupied Kherson, Russia wanted to put on a concert to celebrate Russian occupation of Kherson and to celebrate the fake referendum that they held to make Russia part of Kherson. And this famous composer and orchestra conductor said, no, thank you. Soldiers left his house, came back hours later and killed him. Right? This is obvious what they are doing. It is open. It is not hidden. There is no secret about it. And it is our responsibility when we have all of the information in front of us to act. And yeah. And so from our perspective at Raoul, we want to give people that information, help them understand that there is no ambiguity here. There is nothing that can possibly be confusing. We know exactly what Russia is doing. We know exactly what their motivation is. We know exactly what the intent is. And we have the power to not only act, but to lead the rest of the world acting.
We shall see.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, part of the analysis for genocide and is whether or not Russia intends to destroy Ukrainians in part, because that's also genocide. And so we use the state responsibility framework, which, as I mentioned, is a little different than trying individuals who have, protection that it's much harder to convict individuals. But the state's standards are lower. And so even by individual criminal law standards, as the ICTY, the appeals chamber, when they assessed whether the Bosnian Muslims were destroyed and whether the intention was to destroy in part, and in part is defined as a substantial part, but substantial not only numerically as proportionate to the overall population that's being targeted, but also substantial in terms of what control Russia has, let's say. So in occupied areas, that's their control. They don't have control over all of Ukraine. So numerically relative to what they can actually control. But also, interestingly, the appeals chamber also said, quote, the fate of Bosnian Muslims in Srebrenica would be emblematic of that of all Bosnian Muslims. And so the court talks about this demonstrative effect of kind of openly targeting the group as a message. And so that is also an element that the court considers when you're defining whether or not the intent is to destroy a group in part. Is that part being showcased as what will happen if you self-identify as Ukrainian? And so even in the criminal context, we have a lot of evidence of genocide. And so from both standards, this should be a no-brainer resolution. And we also have intercepts, not only about rape, but from soldiers, saying we've had orders to kill everyone we see. This was in Bucha, I believe. And so there's also very blatant kind of intercepts of orders as genocidal, and also not to mention the inherently genocidal threats to nuke parts of Ukraine.
Yes, it's absolutely spot on about Srebrenica. I would just also add something that I really came to appreciate as someone who worked in Bosnia and Herzegovina after the war. More than 1,000 mosques were destroyed in the Ottoman era. These are very sacred, beautiful cultural sites. And in the report, in the Newlines Raoul Wallenberg report, you address damage to these cultural and sacred sites, including Orthodox Christian sites, but schools, libraries, theaters. This is also genocide in part or whole, destroying their culture. This is very devastating. It's like the last of the last. Let's just wipe you out. Let's wipe out every representation of this group. This was generated at Nuremberg, and the jurisprudence was really advanced under ICTY with regard to cultural heritage. The destruction of the National Library in Sarajevo is devastating. Conquest by the Serbs. I would just add, Mr. Putin has no filter here. He's going to destroy everything. And there has to be accountability for this. I'll just add this. Now I'm going to open it up to people's comments and questions. Yeah.
Related to
You want to go first?
Sure. I have a comment and then a fairly simple question. In the quick discussion about courts and different ways of persecuting genocide, Razem recently had a Twitter space conversation specifically about recognizing Russia's actions in Ukraine as a genocide. Yonah was a guest on this Twitter space, as well as Erin Rosenberg, who is also a Newlines Institute colleague and an international lawyer, and she said something that I think everyone in the audience should also hear, and it's that courts cannot stop a genocide. And I think this goes over a lot of people's heads sometimes, especially when through Razem's advocacy work, we work with the general public and try to make the case of recognizing Russia's actions in Ukraine as genocide. And many people just want to default to, oh, the courts will figure it out. It's way above, my pay grade, my understanding. There's international courts and tribunals, and they'll figure it out, and everything will be okay. But it's too late for that, and it's the state's responsibility to properly deal with the genocide after it's already begun. And my question is tangentially related. Azeem, you mentioned, and this is a fact that sometimes I think a lot of people forget, but there are 150 signatories of the Genocide Convention, which leaves about 40 states that are not signatories. And in theory or hypothetically don't recognize genocide as a crime. I don't know. What are some of the reasoning behind not being a signatory to the Genocide Convention, and is it relevant to recognizing Russia's actions in Ukraine as genocide?
Yeah, so my colleague can speak on the international law aspect, but yeah, so you're absolutely right. There's 151 countries that are signatories to the Genocide Convention, including Russia. So the obligation thus falls on all of them. But the convention is actually what they call orgo omnis, which is independent duty in all. It's an obligation of member states that they owe to one another. So whether you're a signatory or not is almost immaterial. But I think Yonah could probably speak a bit more on that in terms of why countries do not sign up to it.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not really sure why those 40 odd states have not ratified, but the states under discussion have all ratified it. And even if you haven't ratified the Genocide Convention, it's such a fundamental part of international law, as he mentioned, that it's considered, customary international law, whether or not you sign a treaty, but also the duty to prevent falls on all 152 state parties. It's a crime that concerned the international community as a whole, and it was recognized in 1948. And so it basically has this. It's a super precedent kind of. It's the most foundational kind of treaty of the post-war era. So it's a universal treaty.
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to all of you. You all have done, the colossal work of, laying out all the facts of, Russia's breaches of the Genocide Convention in Ukraine. And, as we've said multiple times, right, the no-brainer step is to recognize, on the state levels, this genocide. So what is the next step? How do these states interpret, their state responsibilities, outside of the framework of justice, and punishment? Like, how do they interpret their responsibility to prevent? And how, where should we be pushing, after we take these no-brainer steps?
So I can very quickly touch upon that. So the duty to prevent varies from state to state, depending on obviously the power and authority of that state. So the convention does not necessarily state exactly what, this doesn't offer a roadmap in terms of what the country should actually do. But there are rulings on the ICJ which give you a very good indication. And essentially, to summarize it clearly states that countries have to do everything within the political, economic power to actually isolate and put pressure on that country. So as I indicated, if countries have trade agreements or anything else with a genocidal state, by international law, they are permitted to break those agreements without sanctions. As well, if this country is engaged in genocide, and we can basically break this trade agreement that we have with them without international sanction. But none of the countries are utilising this for the reasons aforementioned reasons. So I think that the challenge is that the Genocide Convention, despite it being such a foundational piece of international law, is that it's on every occasion, and within my lifetime, I've seen so many of these happen. Bosnia, Kosovo, Rwanda, Uyghurs, Rohingya, and now Ukraine, and it just seems really bizarre because every time we say never again, and then we say yet again. And it just continuously happens because states simply do not want to meet their obligations. And the only other thing I would add is that if you want to know what Putin is doing and what he planned to do, there was no secret about it. One just had to look at Chechnya and look at Syria and what he did there. It was a systematic campaign to destroy civilian infrastructure, to destroy water plants, to destroy electricity stations, to destroy power plants and sanitation, everything. Like, so I know, and a very good partner of Raoul, Dr. Zahir Saloon, the president and founder of Med Global, he was the only American doctor in Aleppo, being bombed, the only American physician there. And he told us explicitly, first of all, they started bombing all the hospitals. They made sure they bombed every single hospital systematically. And then one of the hospitals, they moved it to an underground car park. And they brought in special bunker buster bombs to target that as well. So this is a systematic campaign that they have to destroy civilian infrastructure, to make the life of civilians as miserable as possible. So there's absolutely no secret there. There's no surprises there at all. And anybody that tells you that they're shock horror, is simply not paying attention to what they did in Syria and before that in Chechnya. We simply just made all sorts of excuses to not take any action on those fronts.
Yes, I mean, Russian Federation is a lawless state. More than 200 judgments have been rendered against it in the European Court of Human Rights. So what?
Yeah.
It is just paper, and Europe has been dancing around it for a long time. I mean, this is, as you said, this is no surprise.
Yeah.
Any other comments, questions?
I can add, I think,
Please.
so I often go to the International Court of Justice. It's the the chief UN court and world body kind of court, and it's also probably the most conservative court in the world. Like, conservative in the sense of they're very careful not to say anything that might upset any countries because of all the state members, right? And so but even the International Court of Justice has said that there's a duty to act, as soon as a state becomes aware of the serious risk of genocide, or could even surmise that there might be a serious risk. And at that point, the ICJ said that states have to employ all means reasonably available so as to prevent genocide as far as possible. And so it's a very open-ended kind of all means reasonably available. And even one concurring judge said that passivity or indifference constitutes a breach of the Genocide Convention. So, the US, let's say, remains passive and doesn't even identify that there's a serious risk or that we need to prevent acts of genocide. That itself is a breach of the convention. So states have to be on their toes about whether or not they're complicit or are themselves breaching the Genocide Convention. But I will say one practical piece of legislation that the US can now adopt, same way that Canada became the first country to make into law allowing confiscation of of seized assets connected to sanctioned individuals or entities for the purposes of reconstruction, restoring international peace and security, and compensating victims. Very non-controversial as well, in my opinion. Although, so the first step would be to recognize this resolution, but also to allow for once they have seized assets of the architects behind the war, to allow for the confiscation, for the repurposing to compensate Ukrainians as something that they can do to prevent genocide.
So Christopher, the only thing I'll say to advise maybe Razom is that you get this resolution through during Labor Day, because it will evaporate on January 3rd
Believe me,
with the new Congress.
it is not an accident that that this is one of our main things. And
Sure.
to add, yeah, I have, by the way, for everyone, watching online, I printed out QR codes. If you would like to, if you would like to support our campaign, you can scan this link and go and write to your congressperson and your senator to ensure that they support these resolutions. And one thing I will say is that in the same Twitter space that Marina mentioned in her question, where Yonah was speaking, we also had a senior advisor at the Helsinki Commission speaking, who said that part of the reason why we need to do it right now is because it's already too late. We should have done it months ago. And today is too late. Tomorrow will be another day too late.
Right.
And the faster that we can get this recognized, the more we can do to actually act to prevent. And we will also be operating from that understanding formally. Like we will know formally that everything that we are doing has an impact on Russian atrocities, and that our responsibility as a country is to prevent further acts of genocide in Ukraine.
You have the last word. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. I want to thank our guests. Thank you so much for your presentations and this important report. I wish Newlines and the Raoul Wallenberg Center all the best in their future endeavors. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
You need to take a copy of the reports.
Yeah, thank you.
Good. Yeah, I know.